And good morning to the entire House. Mr. Speaker, as I rise to make my contribution to these debates, I must first endorse all that my colleagues on this side of the House have so eloquently and passionately espoused. At the same time, I must note my observation, Mr. Speaker, that the majority of the speakers from the government benches read from prepared speeches. And it was evident that for some of them it was the first time they were reading the speeches. Mr. Speaker, there were some uncharacteristic grammatical errors and mispronunciations. So it is evident to us here, and from their body language and their robotic delivery, and it lacked conviction for us, Mr. Speaker. And it is evident that they have clearly conceded this debate already. Mr. Speaker, I'm questioning whether I heard correctly. I just heard the Honourable Member, Don Hastings Williams, concede that the APNU AFC coalition government lost the local government elections miserably. Those are her words, miserably. We hear from this Honourable Member once a year, it seems, Mr. Speaker. We are still, after hearing that exposition, clueless as to what the minister is responsible for. The minister responsible for publicity and public affairs. It should be renamed something else, Mr. Speaker. Maybe the Department of Propaganda and Fake News. Let me remind the honourable member of undisputed historical fact. The PPP, took over a bankrupt country in 1992, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and we left you in 2015 with a robust, vibrant economy. And you must take credit for the abysmal state it is in at present. That's your legacy. You own that. You own that. Mr. Speaker, as my honourable colleague, Mr. Sirat, said, it is hope, it is our expectation that this being the fifth budget of the coalition government, that they would finally get it right. But alas, Mr. Speaker, we were again disappointed. The entire nation was astounded. We sitting here in the opposition benches were at a loss for any clue of any vision, any policy that will make a difference, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if this really, the 2019 budget is really the instrument by which the coalition government policies are to be translated into action, then we are in deep trouble in this country, Mr. Speaker. Deep trouble. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm so happy that the Honourable Minister of Public Infrastructure raised the issue of the Barbies Bridge. As a matter of fact, yesterday afternoon, the Honourable Minister lamented the fact that the MPs from Region 6, our MPs from Region 6, did not mention the bridge. And he acknowledge the tremendous importance of that bridge to Regions 5 and 6. I'm so happy about that. Need I remind the Minister that this bridge is a PPP project executed and delivered. Was delivered under the leadership, the stewardship of President Barra Jagdeo. It is our bridge. We built it. We are proud of that achievement. It came at zero cost to the taxpayers and the national coffers. Zero cost. We are proud of what we achieved, Mr. Speaker, through that public-private partnership. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister has not recovered from this election gimmick that was orchestrated by the chairman of the board, who happened to be an AFC member. The election gimmick that backfired spectacularly. It backfired, Mr. Speaker. This puerile attempt to again fool Barbicians and to drive fear into them that the bridge tolls will be raised come November 12th Look at the date, Mr. Speaker. The bridge toll, the date local government elections were to be held, that the tolls would have been raised by 300-odd%. That never happened. It was a gimmick. It backfired. It was like a grenade thrown back into their laps and it exploded, Mr. Speaker. And they were dealing with the after effect. Now, Mr. Speaker, you see what happened. The Honourable Minister was not given this opportunity to rush in like a knight in shining armor and save the Barbies. They saw through that. They saw through that ploy, that gimmick, Mr. Speaker, and they rejected it. Like they rejected the Honourable Prime Minister and the Honourable Minister Ramjatan in Barbies. They rejected it, Mr. Speaker. Now, well, Mr. Speaker, but what of the action, now that the government, Mr. Speaker, has rushed in and privatized, nationalized that bridge, Mr. Speaker, they must tell us now, what are the plans? What are the plans? Like I see the honourable gentleman is leaving the house. How sad. I did not hear from him, the honourable minister, what are the plans? I did not hear a word of the Barbies Bridge in the budget presentation. So we are left in the dark as to the day-to-day management. What will happen? Are they going to pay the investors the premium price for the shares as they did with another investor, DDL? Is that going to happen? When is it going to happen? When is it going to happen, Mr. Speaker? Now, and look at what they have done to investor confidence. Look at what they have done to investor confidence. We may never have such a public-private partnership again, because they have shattered that relationship, that confidence that any investor will have in our country. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm so happy that the Honourable Minister raised it. And now, Mr. Speaker, the Abad situation could become worse because the matter is now in court. And I trust that the Minister will do the sensible thing. And
bring your brains now. We left your brain zone for again.
And would not have the Honourable Attorney General's Chambers represent him in this matter in court, because that will, because of the Chambers' dubious track record, Mr. Speaker, that could spell disaster, and we or the citizens here will have to pay for that from the national covers again, Mr. Speaker. And particularly given the fact that what the CCJ has said in a judgment recently about the performance or the lack of performance or incompetence of that ministry, Mr. Speaker, in dealing with legal matters and representing the state. Mr. Speaker, it was our fervent hope It was our fervent hope, Mr. Speaker, and in the hope of the private sector, the business community, small and large businesses, farmers, contractors, laborers, you name it, Mr. Speaker. Every hard-working Guyanese across the length and breadth of Guyana hoped that they would have seen a reversal of the most oppressive tax regime imaginable imposed through the last 4 budgets on the citizens of this country. It is hoped that we would have seen a people-friendly budget, a budget that would have stimulated growth, investor confidence, consumer confidence, and employment for the over 30,000 persons the coalition have rendered jobless, rendered unemployed. But again, Mr. Speaker, that was not to be. Instead, Mr. Speaker, another 30 billion more would be sucked out of the economy and from the pockets of the Guyanese in taxes by the measures implemented in this budget when it is passed. There will be less money in circulation, less money in the hands of consumers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the private sector, in particular the business community, have been particularly hard hit. Whether they are in Regent Street here in Georgetown or Pitt Street in New Amsterdam, wherever they are in the country, Mr. Speaker, it is the same. Mr. Speaker, let me give you a particular instance. One particular instance. There's a businessman in New Amsterdam who, in 2015, when the PPP was in power, did employ 29 persons. Now, a mere 3.5 years later, Mr. Speaker, do you have any idea how many persons he has on his payroll? The number has shrunk to 12. 12. From 29 to 12. And why? What has changed? The government changed, Mr. Speaker. The government changed. That is all the change. We have had 3.5 years of APNU AFC, and the sales of all these businesses have plummeted by more than 50%. Under the PPP, Mr. Speaker, this very businessman at Christmas time had to close his doors. Had to close his doors on customers. He was so overwhelmed with business, with sales. Now, Mr. Speaker, the sales have dropped by more than 50%. Christmas has been postponed, Mr. Speaker. Christmas has been postponed, particularly in Barbies. If the businesses have not invested to stock their stores, they have no confidence in the government or in the economy to do so. And conversely, Mr. Speaker, the consumers are not spending. They are holding on to whatever little they have left after all the taxes are collected, Mr. Speaker. The towns, New Amsterdam, Rosal, Corrigan are flat. Something has to give, Mr. Speaker. We cannot continue in this vein. And what is also assisting or helping, or the major impediment crippling the businesses, Mr. Speaker, is GRA and the customs. And what goes on, the actions and the operations of the Customs Department, a major impediment to commerce and importation of goods, Mr. Speaker. We have seen a drastic reduction in the importation of goods. And that means less revenue. Less revenue. I can't understand how the honorable members on the other side cannot get it. So, Mr. Speaker, if you have a robust importation and the businessmen are bringing in hundreds of containers as they did in the past, certainly you will get more revenue from that. You see, that is the fundamental difficulty we have. The honorable members on that side do not grasp that simple concept. They cannot grasp that simple concept. So instead of bringing in 100 containers, the businessman is bringing in 10 now, Mr. Speaker. Look at the loss of revenue. In Barbies alone, it translates to billions of dollars in losses, Mr. Speaker. Now, the other impediment to progress and to commerce, Mr. Speaker, is the compliance section at the GRA departments throughout this country, and in particular in Barbies, Mr. Speaker. It takes months to get a certificate of compliance issued to go ahead and do a sale of a property. The files have to leave Barbies and come to Georgetown. Why is that so? Why is that so? And before it happened a day. Before it happened. And this, Mr. Speaker, is preventing the department itself from collecting revenue. They are delaying the collection of revenue by their inefficiencies and incompetence, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Mr. Siraj, spoke at length about what is happening in the agriculture sector. I will not repeat what he has said, Mr. Speaker, just to point out that if agriculture and in general rice was important or high on the coalition's agenda, Mr. Speaker, how come there are no direct, tangible measures? Measures in this document, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking of measures. No measures addressing the sector. Nothing here in terms of measures to alleviate the plight, as Honorable Member Siraj spoke about. The hardship that the rice industry is facing, Mr. Speaker. And the Honorable Minister spoke about farm-to-market roads. Where are those roads going to be built, Mr. Speaker? Because we know as a direct result of the government's inaction and refusal to build those roads or maintain the roads in Barbies, Mr. Speaker, thousands of acres of rice could not be harvested, Mr. Speaker. There were tremendous losses that the rice farmers suffered. And the farmers then sought a meeting with the Honorable Minister. And it was told to them, Mr. Speaker, that the coalition, the APNU-AFC coalition, will not spoil rice farmers as the PPPC did. Mr. Speaker, is putting in the necessary infrastructure.
I'll remember you have 5 minutes remaining.
To have the farmers bring out their produce, spoiling rice farmers, Mr. Speaker. That was a sad statement, Mr. Speaker, but it shows how interested they are in agriculture in general, Mr. Speaker, and rice in particular. Now, Mr. Speaker, as to one measure quickly in the budget here, the measures in support of persons living with disabilities. On the face of it, it is very commendable that the government recognizes that more needs to be done. But I question, Mr. Speaker, and these are genuine concerns, Mr. Speaker. It is commendable, but I question who will this benefit? Mr. Speaker, duty-free. Now, was there any consultation done? Did the ministry actually go out and find out from any of these organizations that, look, what is it that you need? And did those organizations respond and say, hey, we want duty-free vehicles? Never. I cannot believe that, Mr. Speaker. That would never happen. They have other more important priorities. Before they could get to the vehicles, Mr. Speaker, help them to read so they could get a driver's license so they could drive the vehicles, Mr. Speaker. Implement a holistic plan for our school children. There is none, Mr. Speaker. There is no plan that the coalition government in 3.5 years has implemented for children with disabilities who are attending school, Mr. Speaker. No plan whatsoever. And there is nothing in the school system. Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago, I had a conversation with a nice young lady from the Department of Education in New Amsterdam. She was waiting, Mr. Speaker. She's dealing with disabilities. She was waiting on a help or aid for a grant from the USAID, Mr. Speaker. That was 1 year ago. That never materialized. So, Mr. Speaker, all I'm saying that the resources would be better utilized if they were put towards directly in the schools. Come up, train the specialists, the therapists, the people who need and who can teach these children, so give them one-on-one attention, and that will benefit these children and people with disabilities as a whole. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, in the field of psychology, Mr. Speaker, there is what is referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. It is a cognitive bias in which unskilled people or poor performers make poor decisions and reach erroneous conclusions, and their incompetence denies them the metacognitive ability to recognize their mistakes. In other words, Mr. Speaker, let me break it down for the Honourable Member Ramjatan. The people who are incompetent at something are incapable of recognizing their own incompetence. It's illusory superiority, Mr. Speaker. And it is a disease that is affecting the entire coalition government en bloc. So,
I remember you have 2 minutes remaining.
Was correct when he said that they need to seek help from Dr. Byro. They may need several specialists, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has shown that it is impervious to reasoning. They will not listen to us here, Mr. Speaker. We understand that. That is okay if they do not want to listen to us. But ignoring the cries of the masses, Mr. Speaker, ignoring the electorate, ignoring the shellacking that they received at the just concluded local government elections, Mr. Speaker, would be their undoing. The Guyanese people will have their final say in 2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.